One of the most unsettling cases that Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross documented in her clinical archives during her practice in Zurich didn't involve clinical death or a prolonged coma, but something equally disconcerting for a researcher trained in the rigor of the scientific method. It concerned a 4-year-old boy, the son of a third-generation American family with no known Germanic ancestry, who suddenly began speaking German with a fluency that defied all conventional explanations of child neurology and language acquisition. The child's mother, an elementary school teacher in a small Connecticut town, sought out the doctor not through a conventional medical referral, but through an informal network of parents who had heard about her pioneering work with children exhibiting inexplicable memories or behaviors. The case reached her in 1973, a period when Kübler-Ross had already consolidated her international reputation with the publication of her studies on the dying and grief process, but hadn't yet fully delved into the controversial territory of experiences that challenged the materialistic paradigms of consciousness. During the first interview, conducted at her clinic in Zurich, the researcher observed the boy with the clinical eye that characterized her approach. The child presented with completely normal cognitive and motor development for his age, with no signs of neurological, psychotic, or dissociative disorders. His parents reported that, at 3.5, he had begun uttering isolated words in a language neither of them initially recognized. They thought it was an invented language, common in children of that age range who develop imaginary languages as part of the natural creative process. However, when the maternal grandmother, who had served as a nurse in Europe during the Second World War, visited the family, she immediately identified the language as German. Not just German, but a specific Bavarian dialect, spoken with an accent and grammatical constructions that she recognized from her time in field hospitals near Munich. Initially, the family attributed the phenomenon to some inadvertent exposure, perhaps television programs or German neighbors. A meticulous investigation, documented by the mother in a notebook she brought to the first consultation, systematically ruled out all these possibilities. Dr. Kübler-Ross, maintaining the methodological skepticism that guided her practice, initially requested a full neurological evaluation. Electroencephalograms, reflex examinations, cognitive development tests. Everything was within the normal parameters expected for a healthy 4-year-old. She then consulted linguist colleagues at the University of Zurich, who agreed to conduct an informal assessment of the vocabulary and syntax employed by the boy. What they discovered left her deeply uneasy. The boy wasn't just speaking German, he was speaking it with vocabulary and idiomatic expressions that weren't contemporary. He used terms and linguistic constructions common in the 1920s and 1930s, including regional Bavarian slang that had fallen out of use after the war. Even more disturbing was the emotional content of his speech. When he entered these states, which occurred spontaneously and unpredictably, usually toward twilight, the boy didn't play or chatter like a child. He cried. He cried with a depth of suffering that the doctor, after decades of working with terminally ill patients and their families, recognized as the mature grief of an adult who had lost something irreplaceable. And he cried for a woman. He called her Margaret, pronouncing the name with devastating tenderness, describing her in detail that no 4-year-old child should have been able to articulate. He spoke of her hands, how they smelled of fresh-baked bread and lavender, how her brown hair had golden highlights when the afternoon light entered the kitchen window, how her laugh sounded like distant church bells. Dr. Kübler-Ross recorded these sessions on magnetic tape, an archive she would keep for decades as one of the most disconcerting of her career. What disturbed her wasn't just the inexplicable linguistic fluency, but the emotional quality of the boy's experience. He wasn't inventing a story or acting a part. He was reliving a memory, or something that behaved in all observable aspects like a genuine memory, complete with the corresponding emotional charge. Her initial attempts at explanation followed the conventional paths of child psychology. Could it be an elaborate fantasy, a psychological construction to deal with some unidentified trauma or emotional deprivation. Analysis of the family environment discarded this hypothesis. The parents were present, loving, with no history of abuse or neglect. The boy had an older sister with whom he maintained a healthy and normal relationship. There were no recent losses in the family, no unresolved grief that could be being processed through this bizarre psychological construction. The hypothesis of cryptomnesia, hidden memories of past exposures to the language that the child didn't consciously recall, was also meticulously investigated. The doctor interviewed all adults who had had regular contact with the boy since birth, including nannies, daycare teachers, neighbors, and distant relatives. None of them spoke German or had substantial knowledge of the language. The family had never traveled to Europe. The television programming the child had access to was reviewed, as were all the children's books in the house. Nothing explained not only the vocabulary, but especially the authentic pronunciation and the command of complex grammatical structures. It was during the 5th observation session that the episode occurred that would transform the researchers' approach to the case. The boy was quietly drawing, an activity the doctor frequently used to establish rapport with children, when he suddenly dropped the crayon and began speaking in German with increasing urgency. Kübler-Ross, who was fluent in the language since childhood in Switzerland, understood every word. He described a specific house, a 2-story building with green shutters and a garden where apple trees grew. He spoke of a bakery on the corner where a man called Herr Bachmann baked strudel every Thursday morning. But what made the doctor stop her notes and simply listen with full attention was when the boy began to describe the last day. He narrated with a clarity and sequentiality that defied his chronological age, a winter morning when he had woken up next to Margaret, how the faint January light entered through the frosted bedroom window, how she had gotten up before him to prepare coffee. He described the smell of burnt chicory that substituted for real coffee, a detail that immediately situated the narrative in a period of scarcity, possibly during or soon after the war. Then his voice changed, acquiring a quality of retrospective panic. He spoke of sirens, of a sharp, piercing sound that tore through the morning, of how he had run downstairs looking for her, screaming her name, of how he found her in the basement, but something was wrong. The ceiling had partially collapsed, and she was under the rubble. The boy, in this impossible narrative, described his own desperate efforts to move the wooden beams and bricks, how his hands bled, how she was still breathing but couldn't speak, only looked at him with an expression that he couldn't bear to recall. Dr. Kübler-Ross observed the tears streaming down the child's face, but they were tears of a particular kind. It wasn't the crying of a scared or confused child. It was the existential grief of someone reliving the worst moment of their existence, carrying the weight of an incomprehensible guilt. He repeated in German that he should have arrived faster, that he should have been stronger, that he should have saved her. When the episode finally passed, about 20 minutes later, the boy seemed exhausted, confused about where he was, and returned to speaking exclusively in English, without any conscious memory of what he had just narrated. The researcher, trained to maintain clinical distance, found herself deeply perturbed. There were 2 possibilities her scientific mind needed to consider. The first was that the child had been exposed somehow to detailed historical narratives about bombings in Germany during the Second World War, absorbed this information through some unidentified channel, and was processing it through a complex, fantastical elaboration. This explanation, though improbable given the meticulous investigation already carried out, remained within the limits of what conventional science could accept. The second possibility was the one that Dr. Kübler-Ross had begun to seriously consider only in the latter years of her practice, influenced by observations accumulated over decades of working with dying patients. It was the hypothesis that human consciousness was not necessarily confined to the limits of a single biological existence, that memories or aspects of identity could, through mechanisms completely unknown to contemporary neuroscience, persist or transfer beyond physical death. This possibility, which she maintained as an open question and not a conclusion, was precisely the type of investigation that put her scientific reputation at permanent risk. What made this case particularly significant in her archives was what happened 3 months after that 5th session. The boy's mother telephoned the clinic in Zurich, her voice trembling in a way the doctor immediately recognized as the shock of someone confronted with something that completely defies their understanding of reality. The family had decided on their own and without consulting the researcher to investigate the boy's narrative. They hired a genealogist in Munich, providing the specific details the child had mentioned, including the name Margaret, the description of the house with green shutters, Herr Bachmann's bakery, and most importantly, the bombing. The genealogist, working with municipal records, war archives, and property documents preserved in the city archives, managed to identify a residence that corresponded precisely to the description. The house had existed in a residential neighborhood of Munich, destroyed during an Allied bombing in January 1945. More disturbing still, civilian casualty records indicated that a woman named Margareta Vogel, 28 years old, had died at that specific address during the attack. She was married to a man named Johann Vogel, whose date of death was recorded as occurring 3 days after the bombing in a military hospital on the outskirts of the city, officially due to complications from injuries sustained during a civilian rescue attempt. Dr. Kübler-Ross requested copies of all documents. She examined the death certificates, property records, photographs of the neighborhood before the destruction that were located in historical archives. There was even a photograph of the street, taken in 1938 by a local photographer, where it was possible to identify the house with its characteristic green shutters. On the corner of the same street, a small bakery with a sign where the name Bachmann could be read, although blurred by the image quality. The correspondence between the details provided by a 4-year-old American child with no known connection to Germany and verifiable historical records of events that occurred 3 decades before his birth was the type of evidence that the researcher had learned to meticulously document, but also to present with extreme caution. In her private notes, she wrote that this case represented either the most extraordinary coincidence she had ever documented or a window into processes of consciousness that Western science hadn't even begun to adequately investigate. However, her scientific training required her to continue seeking alternative explanations. Could there be some undocumented genealogical connection between the American family and the Vogels in Munich? An additional investigation, this time conducted by genealogists in both the United States and Germany, found no link. The boy's ancestors had emigrated from England and Ireland in the 19th century, with no identifiable Germanic branch in the family tree that was reconstructed back to the early 18th century. Dr. Kübler-Ross then turned her attention to a deeper analysis of the observable patterns in the child's behavior. What particularly intrigued her was the cyclical and involuntary nature of the episodes. The boy had no conscious control over when the German emerged, nor did he seem to have voluntary access to the memories he described. It was as if a second layer of identity or memory occasionally superimposed itself on his primary consciousness, usually triggered by specific sensory stimuli. The smell of baking bread, the sound of distant sirens, the particular quality of light at dusk in winter, all of these were documented triggers that preceded the episodes. This involuntary and fragmented characteristic was consistent with what she had begun to identify in other similar cases she investigated over the years. There was a recurring pattern in young children, generally between 2 and 6 years old, who presented with what she began to call in her private notes, interposed memories. These memories didn't behave like normal creative childhood fantasies. They were intrusive, charged with adult emotions inappropriate for the child's age, frequently centered on traumas or significant losses, and contained verifiable details that the child could not have acquired through conventional means. What particularly differentiated these cases from fanciful constructions was the quality of the emotional suffering. Dr. Kübler-Ross had spent years studying grief in its deepest forms, working with widows, parents who lost children, concentration camp survivors. She knew the specific texture of mature grief, the way it manifested in body language, in the breathing pattern, in the quality of the voice. And it was precisely that quality that she observed in the 4-year-old boy when he cried for Margaret. It wasn't the performative sadness of a child who lost a toy or is tired. It was the existential grief of someone who lost the person around whom their entire life was organized. The interpretive tradition that the researcher found most useful for contextualizing these phenomena, although she never mentioned it publicly for fear of being misunderstood, came from ancient texts she had studied during her cross-cultural investigations into concepts of death and the continuity of consciousness. There were detailed descriptions in millennia-old literature about how aspects of individual identity could persist after physical death, carrying with them not only factual memories, but especially deep emotional impressions, particularly those related to unresolved traumas or intense emotional bonds. These traditions described processes by which these impressions could, under specific circumstances, manifest in a new incarnation, particularly during the first years of life when the present identity was not yet completely consolidated. What fascinated her was that these ancient descriptions corresponded surprisingly well to the empirical patterns she was observing. The children with interposed memories generally stopped manifesting them between 5 and 7 years of age, precisely the period when the current identity solidified, and the previous memories, if they could be called that, were progressively suppressed or integrated unconsciously. In the specific case of the boy who cried for Margaret, Dr. Kübler-Ross observed that the episodes began to decrease in frequency and intensity after he turned 6. By the age of 7, they had completely ceased. The boy retained no conscious memory of the episodes in German, and when his mother tried to ask about Margaret or the house in Munich, he looked at her with genuine confusion, without any recognition. It was as if a temporary window had closed, and the present identity had finally established complete dominance over consciousness. The researcher maintained contact with the family for over a decade after the initial case. The boy grew up normally, became an adolescent with no particular interest in Germany or the German language, went on to college studying engineering, a choice completely dissociated from anything that could relate to his childhood experiences. There was no apparent residual trauma, no lasting psychological disturbance. It was as if those intense episodes from age 4 to 6 were a completely isolated phenomenon in his biography, an anomaly that left no permanent marks on his personality or psychological functioning. But for Dr. Kübler-Ross, the case remained as one of the most significant in her long investigation into the nature of human consciousness. It represented the type of evidence that was simultaneously convincing and impossible to prove conclusively. All conventional explanations had been systematically ruled out through rigorous investigation. The correspondence between the child's accounts and verifiable historical facts was documented and incontestable. Nevertheless, the conclusion that these data seemed to suggest that consciousness or aspects of identity could somehow persist beyond biological death and manifest in a new life remained in the territory of the speculative and the non-verifiable by conventional scientific methods. What made her position particularly difficult was the nature of the scientific community to which she belonged. Psychiatry and medicine of the late 20th century operated within a strictly materialistic paradigm, where consciousness was considered an epiphenomenon of brain activity, completely dependent on and limited to the neurological substrate. Any suggestion that consciousness could exist independently of the brain, or that memories and aspects of identity could transcend physical death, was automatically relegated to the realm of pseudoscience, religious superstition, or magical thinking. Dr. Kübler-Ross was deeply aware of this context. Her reputation had been built through meticulously documented work on the psychological aspects of the dying process, research that was respected precisely because it remained within the accepted limits of conventional scientific investigation. Venturing into the territory of phenomena that suggested continuity of consciousness beyond death was to risk not only her individual credibility, but potentially compromise the acceptance of all her previous work on palliative care and end-of-life patient support. For this reason, she kept cases like that of the boy who spoke German in her private archives, sharing them only with a very restricted circle of colleagues she knew to be sufficiently open to considering evidence that challenged the dominant paradigm without automatically dismissing it. In her official publications and academic presentations, she remained carefully within the limits of what was considered scientifically respectable, focusing on psychological and emotional aspects of the dying process that could be studied through conventional methods. However, in her private reflections, documented in diaries and correspondence she maintained, the researcher was much more open about the implications of what she was observing. She wrote about the possibility that Western science, in its eagerness to reject supernatural and religious explanations for natural phenomena, had thrown out something important with the bathwater. That perhaps there existed genuine aspects of human consciousness that could not be completely reduced to neurochemical processes, but were still natural phenomena open to empirical investigation, just operating through mechanisms that current neuroscience lacked the tools to detect or measure. The boy's case raised specific questions that she considered fundamental. If there truly was some kind of continuity of consciousness or memory beyond biological death, how did it work? What was the mechanism? Why did only some children present these interposed memories and not all? Why were the memories always fragmented and emotionally charged, focused on traumas and losses, rarely on mundane or happy aspects of previous lives? Why did they manifest only in the first years of life and then disappear? These questions led her to study more deeply ancient texts that offered explanatory models for these phenomena. She discovered detailed descriptions in millennia-old traditions about how individual consciousness would not be a monolithic, indivisible entity, but composed of different layers or aspects. Some of these layers would be more intimately linked to the physical body and dissolve with death, while others, especially those associated with deep emotional impressions and fundamental identity patterns, might persist. These traditions also described processes by which these persistent impressions could attach to a new incarnation, not as a complete transfer of personality or identity, but as residual fragments that would occasionally emerge, especially when the new identity was still forming. What fascinated her was that this explanatory model, developed thousands of years ago without any knowledge of modern neuroscience, corresponded surprisingly well to the empirical patterns she was observing. The factual and verbalizable memories, those that modern neuroscience associates with the hippocampus and the cortex, disappeared completely in the cases she studied. But the emotional and somatic memories, those associated with the amygdala and more primitive brain systems, persisted in a fragmented and unconscious form. It was as if different aspects of memory had different degrees of connection to the physical substrate, and consequently different capacities to transcend the death of that substrate. The analysis that Dr. Kübler-Ross made of these phenomena was invariably cautious and full of qualifications. She openly recognized that she was speculating far beyond what her data allowed her to conclude with certainty. But she argued that informed and careful speculation was a necessary component of the scientific process, especially when dealing with phenomena that were on the borders or beyond the explanatory capacities of current paradigms. What science could not do, she insisted, was simply ignore robust and verifiable data just because they challenged dominant theoretical assumptions. The long-term follow-up of the boy revealed another intriguing aspect that added an additional layer of complexity to the case. When he was 17, during a conversation with his mother about college choices, he mentioned casually that he had developed an inexplicable aversion to sirens. The sound of ambulances, fire alarms, any sharp, penetrating tone, similar provoked in him a disproportionate anxiety reaction that he couldn't rationally comprehend or control. He described it as a physical sensation in his chest, an urgency to run or act, combined with a profound sadness that had no identifiable object. The mother, immediately remembering the sessions with Dr. Kübler-Ross more than a decade earlier, contacted the researcher to report this observation. What made this detail particularly significant was that the young man had no conscious memory whatsoever of the episodes from his childhood. He didn't know about Margrethe, about the house in Munich, about the bombing he had described with such vivid details at age 4. And yet, a specific emotional mark had persisted, an inexplicable phobia linked precisely to the sound that, in the narrative he didn't recall, had announced the tragedy that took the life of his supposed wife in a previous existence. Dr. Kübler-Ross documented this phenomenon as an example of what she began to call residual somatic impressions. In several cases, she followed over the years. She observed that even after the explicit memories completely disappeared from consciousness, certain specific emotional traces or physical reactions remained, like invisible scars from traumas that the current person never experienced directly. These reactions had no context, made no sense within the known biography of the individual, but they were real, measurable, and caused genuine suffering. This pattern led her to speculate about the stratified nature of memory and identity. Perhaps consciousness was not simply erased and reconstructed from scratch with each new life, but functioned more like a palimpsest, where previous writings were seemingly erased but left subtle marks that occasionally showed through the new writing. The explicit memories, those that could be verbalized and consciously accessed, disappeared relatively early in childhood. But the implicit memories, those encoded in emotional reactions and somatic patterns, could persist in a fragmented and unconscious way. The researcher was careful not to embrace these interpretations as definitive conclusions. She always maintained the stance that she was asking questions, not offering answers. She documented patterns, rigorously analyzed the evidence, considered multiple possible interpretations, but refused to come to definitive conclusions on issues that she recognized were beyond the capacity of resolution with the available methods. Her position was that science should be humble enough to recognize the limits of its current knowledge, brave enough to investigate phenomena that challenged those limits, and honest enough to present the data without distorting it to conform to prior theoretical expectations. This approach, although it partially protected her from more severe criticism, still placed her in a delicate position within the medical and academic community. Many colleagues saw her interest in cases like that of the boy who spoke German as a lamentable distraction from her important and respected work on the process of death and grief. Others covertly accused her of having abandoned scientific rigor in favor of mystical or religious leanings. And some, particularly those committed to a strictly materialistic view of consciousness, saw her work in this area as genuinely dangerous, giving scientific respectability to beliefs they considered superstitious and potentially harmful. The researcher responded to these criticisms by maintaining rigorous standards of documentation and analysis, publishing her more conventional cases in peer-reviewed journals, and being extremely careful with the language she used when discussing the more controversial phenomena. She never claimed to have proof of the survival of consciousness after death or of reincarnation in the popular sense of the term. She always presented her cases as anomalies that deserved further investigation, as data that defied easy explanations, as open questions that future science might be able to answer more adequately. What emerged from her comparative studies with ancient texts was a consistent pattern that transcended specific cultures and historical periods. The millennia-old traditions described a complex process after death in which individual consciousness went through stages of gradual dissolution. Initially, there would be a separation from the densest layers of identity, those intimately linked to physical sensations and bodily needs. This first stage would be relatively quick, occurring in the days or weeks immediately following physical death. Subsequently, there would be an intermediate phase where consciousness, now devoid of a physical body, but still carrying memories, emotions, and identity patterns, would experience a subjective reality shaped by its own accumulated impressions and tendencies. This stage could last for variable periods, depending on the strength of these impressions. Memories charged with intense emotion, particularly those associated with unresolved traumas or deep attachments, would have greater permanence and influence in this intermediate phase. What particularly intrigued Dr. Kübler-Ross was that these ancient descriptions emphasized that traumatic impressions, especially those involving sudden, violent death or circumstances of great emotional suffering, created what could be described as deep scars on consciousness. These scars would have a particular tendency to persist and to manifest in subsequent incarnations, precisely because they represented experiences so intense that they had indelibly marked the consciousness. In the context of the case of Johann Vogel, if that was what the American boy was somehow accessing, the traumatic nature of the experience made perfect sense within this model. A man who had lost his beloved wife under violent circumstances, who had witnessed her suffering without being able to save her, who had carried a devastating guilt for his inability to protect her, and who had died a few days later, probably in a state of profound emotional shock and psychological trauma, would have created precisely the kind of deep impression that these ancient texts suggested could transcend physical death. The researcher found particularly detailed descriptions of how these traumatic impressions would behave in a new life. According to these traditions, they would not manifest as a complete transfer of identity or personality. The new person would not simply be Johann Vogel born again with all his memories and characteristics intact. Instead, it would be a new individuality with its own identity, within which residual fragments of the previous traumatic experience would occasionally emerge, especially during the early years of life, when the boundaries between identities were still porous and fluid. These manifestations would tend to be involuntary, triggered by sensory stimuli that resonated with the original experience, and would be experienced by the child not as memories of someone else, but as their own experiences, although disturbingly inappropriate for their age and known biography. Over time, as the new identity consolidated and the neurological systems matured, these intrusions would become increasingly rare until they ceased completely, although they might leave residual emotional marks that would persist unconsciously. The correspondence between this ancient theoretical model and the empirical patterns that Dr. Kübler-Ross observed in her cases was notable. The involuntary and fragmented nature of the memories, their concentration on traumatic and emotionally intense experiences, the specific temporal window of manifestation in early childhood, the progressive disappearance with age, the persistence of emotional traits even after the loss of explicit memories. All of this fit the model described by these millennia-old traditions with a precision that she found simultaneously fascinating and disconcerting. But the researcher was careful to distinguish between correlation and causation, between explanatory models and empirical reality. The fact that an ancient model corresponded to the observed patterns did not prove that the model was correct in its fundamental premises. It could be that these traditions, through centuries of careful observation of human phenomena, had developed accurate phenomenological descriptions without necessarily understanding the underlying mechanisms. Or it could be that they truly had identified something fundamental about the nature of consciousness that modern science had not yet rediscovered. The question that continued to haunt her, and which she explicitly placed in her private notes, was about the nature of the relationship between consciousness and the brain. The dominant materialistic paradigm treated the brain as the generator of consciousness, with the mind being essentially a product of neurological activity. In this view, when the brain died, consciousness necessarily ceased, as it was completely dependent on the physical substrate that produced it. There was no logical possibility of the survival of consciousness beyond brain death, much less the transfer of memories or aspects of identity to a new brain in a different body. However, cases like that of the boy who spoke German seemed to challenge this simple equation. If consciousness was purely a product of the brain, how to explain verifiable memories of events that occurred decades before the birth of the brain in question? How to explain fluency in a language to which this brain had never been exposed? How to explain the mature, adult emotional quality of the experiences, completely inappropriate for the neurological development level of a 4-year-old child? The researcher considered several alternative models. One of them, which she found in certain philosophical traditions, suggested that perhaps the relationship between consciousness and the brain was more analogous to the relationship between a radio program and a receiving apparatus. The brain would not generate consciousness, but receive, filter, and express it. In this view, consciousness would be a more fundamental field or phenomenon, and the brain would be the instrument through which it manifested in the physical world. When the brain died, consciousness would not necessarily cease. It would only lose its instrument of physical expression. This model had the advantage of accommodating phenomena like memories that transcended the life of the current brain, but had the obvious disadvantage of being completely speculative and without basis in any known physical mechanism. How would this supposed reception of consciousness work? What kind of field or phenomenon would this be that the brain was receiving? How would the information be transmitted? These questions remained completely unanswered, making the model more an interesting metaphor than a testable scientific theory. Another model that Dr. Kübler-Ross explored was based on concepts of collective memory or morphogenetic fields, ideas that some unorthodox scientists had proposed. Perhaps there was some kind of non-local information field, where memories and patterns of experience were stored in a way that transcended individual brains. Under certain circumstances, perhaps a brain could access information from this field that had not been acquired through its own direct experience. This model had the advantage of at least trying to propose a mechanism, but remained highly speculative and without robust experimental evidence. What she honestly acknowledged was that all available models, including the conventional materialistic one, had serious difficulties accommodating the totality of the data she was observing. The materialistic model could not adequately explain cases like the boy's without resorting to increasingly improbable hypotheses of cryptomnesia or extraordinary coincidence. The alternative models accommodated the data more naturally, but lacked identifiable and testable physical mechanisms. She found herself, therefore, in a space of genuine epistemological uncertainty, where no available explanation was completely satisfactory. This position of permanent uncertainty, although intellectually honest, was emotionally difficult to maintain. Dr. Kübler-Ross had dedicated her career to helping people find peace and understanding in the face of death. Many of her terminal patients sought from her not only emotional support, but also some kind of guidance about what they might expect after death. Cases like the boy who spoke German inevitably raised hopes that perhaps consciousness really did continue in some form, that death was not simply the end of everything, that there would be some form of continuity beyond physical annihilation. The researcher found herself in a delicate position between her scientific integrity and her compassionate responsibility toward her patients. She could not in good conscience offer certainties that she did not possess, guarantees based on evidence that remained ambiguous and open to multiple interpretations. But she also could not simply discard the experiences and data she had meticulously documented over decades. Her solution was to share her observations honestly, present the cases and patterns she had identified, but always frame this as open questions instead of definitive answers. She told her patients that she had observed phenomena that defied easy explanations, that she had documented cases that suggested possibilities beyond what the conventional materialistic paradigm allowed, but that she had no conclusive proof of anything. What she could offer were not certainties, but the validation that their questions and hopes were legitimate, that the universe was possibly more mysterious and complex than current science understood, and that maintaining an open mind in the face of the unknown was both scientifically appropriate and humanly understandable. In the specific case of the boy, now an adult, Dr. Kübler-Ross maintained sporadic contact for over 3 decades after the initial case. He grew up to become a successful engineer, married, had children, lived a completely normal and conventional life. He never developed any particular interest in past lives, reincarnation, or paranormal phenomena. For him, the episodes of his childhood, of which he had no conscious memory, were simply a bizarre anecdote in his family history, something his mother occasionally mentioned, but which had no relevance in his adult life. The only exception was the persistent aversion to sirens, which stayed with him into adulthood. Even at 40, he reported in one of the last conversations he had with the researcher, the sound continued to provoke a physical and emotional reaction that he found irrational but could not control. He had learned to manage the reaction, to recognize it when it occurred, and not allow it to significantly interfere with his life. But the trigger remained active. It was as if his body remembered something his conscious mind had completely forgotten. For Dr. Kübler-Ross, the fact that this specific mark had persisted for decades was significant. It suggested that whatever had happened during those episodes of his childhood, whatever the source or nature of those memories and emotions, had left a genuine impression on some level of his being that transcended conscious memory and rational understanding. It was evidence that human experience had depths and complexities that could not be completely captured or explained by the reductionist models dominant in the neuroscience and psychiatry of her time. In the final reflections, she wrote about this case, years later when she was an elderly woman looking back over decades of work. The researcher expressed both satisfaction and frustration. Satisfaction for having maintained her scientific integrity, for having meticulously documented important phenomena regardless of how controversial they were, for having asked the difficult questions that many of her colleagues preferred to avoid. Frustration for not having reached definitive answers, for not having managed to resolve the fundamental mystery of the relationship between consciousness and matter, for not having developed a unified theory that could accommodate both the conventional and the anomalous data she had observed. But she recognized that perhaps this incompleteness was appropriate and even necessary. Science advances not only through answers found, but also through well-formulated questions that remain open for future investigations. Her role, she concluded, was not necessarily to solve these mysteries, but to document them with sufficient rigor and seriousness so that future generations of scientists, with tools and paradigms perhaps more suitable, could continue the investigation. The case of the 4-year-old boy who cried for a wife he never knew in his current life would therefore remain, not as proof of reincarnation or the survival of consciousness, but as a deep and persistent question about the nature of the human mind, a question that would continue to challenge and inspire future investigators who had the courage to look honestly at phenomena that did not easily fit into conventional categories.